Dr. Zakia Rahman, thank you so much for talking to me about this topic today. This is a hot topic right now, and we're going into the holiday season where people may be doing some gift buying. So we want to empower everybody with the right information. But this is also a science podcast. So I'm thrilled to have you on to kind of dig into the physics behind this and what's going on. Can you give me a little background on yourself? For one, I know you're a dermatologist, correct?
Yeah, thank you, Emily, for having me. And as we'll discover in the podcast, it's hot, but not too hot, because that's what photobiomodulation
Nice.
is.
Nice nerdy joke there.
Exactly. The best jokes are the nerdy ones.
Of course.
I am a board certified dermatologist, and I'm a clinical professor of dermatology at Stanford University School of Medicine. And I'm also faculty at the Stanford Center on Longevity. And my area of specialty and expertise is lasers and energy-based devices. And I also sit on the board of the American Society for Laser Medicine and Surgery.
Awesome. Well, you're exactly the person I want to talk to then. Can we talk about red light therapy and what is going on here? Because there's so many misconceptions that I'm seeing out there as well. So let's first of all, talk about exactly what this is when it comes to the electromagnetic spectrum and this color red and why that's important.
Yeah. So I love that your podcast is making science practical and interesting, because I think a lot of times in our education system, we learn stuff and we're like, oh, it's kind of boring because it doesn't have practical implications. But I suspect a lot of your listeners were people who were interested and now can kind of get reinterested in it because they realize the practical implications. So this is stuff we probably first learned in middle school. And so when you look at the entire electromagnetic spectrum, essentially these are measured in photons. So this is light that actually spans all the way from really long wavelengths, which is radio waves and microwaves. And a lot of us have microwaves in our homes. And actually, as a dermatologist who is an expert in lasers and energy-based devices, we actually have a microwave technology that we use to permanently reduce sweating in the armpits. So those are the longer wavelengths of light. And then the shorter wavelengths of light are like the gamma rays and X-rays. And thankfully, our Earth's atmosphere filters all of those out because those can cause a lot of mutations in our DNA. So all of these photons sort of travel in a wave. And the peak between the top of the waves or the bottom is what's called the wavelength. And so again, the longer wavelengths are those radio waves and microwaves, and the shorter ones are the gamma and the X-ray. And then we kind of go right to the middle, and that's kind of the area that we think is the most relevant. And it's relevant because that's what gets to the Earth's surface. So ultraviolet light, and then we have visible light, and we humans like to label everything in accordance to sort of our perspective. So this is visible to humans, but it turns out things like bees and other species can detect different wavelengths of light, like ultraviolet light. But, we humans, we think of visible light as what's visible to us in the back of our eye, these cones in the back of our eye that sense these different pigments. And so the visible light spectrum is 400 to 700 nanometers. And when we think of the shorter wavelengths, and I love teaching our Stanford medical students and our residents this, is that when you think of Roy G. Biv, which we all discovered, right, the R is actually the longer wavelength and the violet is the shorter. And guess what's shorter than violet? Ultraviolet. So that's kind of an easy way for us to remember. And then when you think of red, which is the longer wavelengths, we think of infrared. So when we're talking about those red wavelengths, we're talking maybe 620 to about 700 nanometers.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So a few years ago, the infrared stuff was getting a lot of traction. So I'm curious about safety when it comes to these different wavelengths. And once you start to get up to blues and purples, are you bordering on oh, this isn't so safe anymore? Because we know that UV can be, I guess, harmful to skin, but then you get down to these longer wavelengths like red and infrared, they seem to be very beneficial. So can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly I think safety is and should be, a really should be kind of the top priority. And then after that is effective. But if something's effective, but it's not safe, we wouldn't want to do it. So I always have to weigh the risks and benefits. And so there's a few ways to think about it. So as a laser photobiologist, I think of like the laws of photobiology. So the first is that there's no reaction without absorption. So think of radio waves when, people listen to the radio. Those are really long wavelengths. They don't absorb. They travel through buildings, and so we can listen to that. And so when there is absorption, we have a reaction. So that's why when we think of different wavelengths, it's will they get absorbed? And then the second part of that is what happens when it's absorbed. And there's another law that basically says that the energy matters. So at really high energies, we actually can kill. And we do that to destroy things like cells. And I, in my office, can use really powerful lasers to vaporize or burn off skin cells. Then in medium, you can damage. So you can heat that. And we actually use very controlled light to damage tissue to cause wound healing. But then at very low levels, you actually can stimulate biological functions. So the energy as well as the wavelength, all of those things matter in safety and effectiveness.
Interesting. Okay. So I think a lot of people too, because I've been inside an infrared sauna and the lights are red. So people confuse the two, but they're different, right?
Yes. Yeah, the infrared wavelengths are outside of that. And, we can probably, we can view a little bit more light past 700, but those saunas may have that light, and that might be the visible light portion, but they also have heat. So those infrared saunas, it's not just the light, but it's that heat component of it. And oftentimes I see people who get melasma or pigmentation that's actually stimulated by heat. And we know that can be stimulated by visible light as well. The next thing when we think of energy is we think of something called a chromophore. So that's like a particle that can absorb different wavelengths of light. And blue light is actually used to treat acne because the little bacteria, the P. acnes that's in around the hair follicle absorbs blue light, and that kind of causes it to rupture. And so traditionally, when we think of devices, if people have gone to get laser hair removal, that targets melanin or pigment. And we have different kinds of pigment in our skin. Then you can target hemoglobin, and that hemoglobin can be oxygenated or not oxygenated. And a lot of us who wear smartwatches or have ever gone to the doctor and had a pulse oximeter, we actually use light biology to decide, because the absorption from hemoglobin that has oxygen that doesn't, that shift is what determines and is easy for us to be able to see how much of our blood is oxygenated and if we're sick or not.
Okay. I have an Aura ring and in the morning it like glows. It lights up different colors. So it's using light to determine what's going on in my body.
It is. It shines light on the surface of your skin. And depending on what light reflects back, it's able to determine things like how much oxygen is in your blood. So, yeah,
Wow.
it's for diagnostic and therapeutic purposes. Pretty
Very
cool,
cool.
right?
Yeah, I was wondering how it gave all that information, but that makes so much more sense. Okay, I'm curious how all this was discovered. There had to be some really kind of tragic trial and error when it came to some of these light therapies over time. Like how at one time was someone like, "Hey, guess what? Red light therapy is able to do this," or was it discovered by mistake?
Yeah, I think like a lot of things, it was discovered as a consequence of studying something else. And so I think that's why studying science and scientific investigation and discovery is so important. And we, as laser light biologists and dermatologists, have studied this and brought this into clinical realm since the 1980s. But in the late 1960s, there was actually a Hungarian scientist who wanted to see if red light actually caused cancer. So in laboratory mice, they had mice and then they exposed them. And this was a laser, which is different than a lot of the devices that are out there, which are light emitting diodes. And it exposed them to a ruby laser, which is a red wavelength. And it turned out that the mice didn't develop cancer, but the mice grew hair.
They
Um,
became super mice.
yeah. And so that is, again, it's like you were saying, it's a mistake or just the unintended consequences of researching one thing is that you discover other things. And one of the initial FDA clearances for these red light devices was actually in hair growth.
Yeah, okay. Interesting because I didn't learn about that as a benefit until later. It was more about like the anti-aging is all the rage right now on social media. Does it have to be a certain wavelength of red, or can you like just find a red light anywhere and stand under it and get benefits?
So, this again, I just love to nerd out, but there's this amazing publication that I discovered in 2015 that talked about sort of an alternate theory of evolution. And it's not so like alternate, but it turns out that our ancestors, as they became relatively hairless in sub Saharan Africa, the red and infrared light of the sun actually, because the chromophore for that is in our mitochondria, it's in something called cytochrome C oxidase, which is a process that produces energy for all of our biologic functions in the mitochondria of our cells. And so that, that red wavelength of light actually can stimulate those biological functions. And there's different peaks. So most of the ones that we see are in that red visible wavelength, but there are some commercial devices out there that are in that near infrared too, to give some of those additional benefits.
Is mitochondria? Can you like give me a dummy's explanation of what that is? Because I've read about it, but I still don't get it.
Yeah, well, you are no dummy. You're very smart. And I think the first testament to intelligence is curiosity. So I guess the best way to explain it is think of the organism. So we as humans are the organism. And then you think of the organ. And of course, as a dermatologist, the skin is my favorite organ. It's our largest organ, and it has so many different functions. So then we think of the organ, and then we can think of the organism. And then we go down to organelles. So mitochondria are little organelles. So we think of our cells, and inside them is a little battery, like electric battery or an engine, and that produces ATP, which is essentially the energy needed for almost all of our biological functions. So when we think of it that way, just think of it as the engine of our cells.
Okay, that's a lot easier to comprehend than what I've read before. Well, let's talk about benefits of red light therapy. What are kind of the well-known ones and maybe the lesser well-known ones?
Yeah. So the red light therapy that we're talking about is in energies that are what's called photobiomodulation. And so when we talked about how much heat and energy is given, we're talking about using red light at energies that stimulate biological function. So they don't cause the coagulation or the heating of tissue, they don't cause it to vaporize, they just stimulate that function. And so it was initially called low level laser therapy, and it was used for a long period of time. And a lot of people thought it was pseudoscience, but it turned out that the National Library of Medicine made it an official term that you could search, and it was called PBMT, so photobiomodulation therapy. And that was in 2015. And we in the American Society of Laser Medicine and Surgery, essentially that was the year that we said, that's the year of light, because a lot of this was sort of brought out into the shadows and finally recognized that these have real biological functions. And I think that they're popular now because of social media, right? There are more than 3 billion images uploaded every day. That's, over a trillion every year. And that number is expected to double by the end of this decade, so less than 5 years. And so I think it's popular now, although this is something that's been studied and had FDA clearances for a long period of time. And I'm happy now that people are much more aware of it because, people like me have been singing the praises for a long period of time. The initial clearances, again, were in hair stimulation and probably went back to the studies that were done in mice. But since then, people have been analyzing this data. And one of the things that when we think of artificial intelligence, sort of revolutionizing healthcare, one of the things that we can do is the computational power is getting really fast. So before, we could only analyze a small subset of data. Now we're able to do things like take a small punch biopsy or a little biopsy of the skin and analyze hundreds of thousands of genes and RNA and proteins. So we're finding more and more of these links so we can identify the exact energies needed. But when we think of FDA clearances, they have that for hair growth. They have them for improvement of the pigment of the skin, for improvement of red in the skin, and also for reduction of wrinkles.
Okay. So like if a man came to see you and he was balding and like he was like, what's the most effective way for me to regrow hair? Would you recommend a red light cap?
Yeah, so I would recommend red light as part of a regimen, right? Because when you can combine a lot of different therapies, you can actually reduce. You don't have to give the energy at a much higher level to cause damage. So using a red light device has similar effects to topical minoxidil, and that can cause increase dilation of the blood vessels that supplies the hair. I don't recommend the caps. I prefer things that actually like separate out the hair and target the scalp. And the reason is that by the time that people have so much balding, that some of those hairs have permanently miniaturized or kind of died. So when people come in and they're coming earlier, I'd rather have them use like a comb or something that separates out and gets to the scalp, because our hair is really good at deflecting light. And you and I both have long hair. And it turns out that women are less likely to get skin cancer on their ears because our hair covers and so it blocks some of that ultraviolet light, and men are more likely to get that.
Oh, yeah, makes
So
sense.
we want a device that can actually get to the scalp, the source of it.
Okay. Well, the ones that people are wearing on their faces, do they ever have the unintended consequence of like facial hair growing?
Such a brilliant question. I literally was like, you teed me up because I was going to say that next, right? Because you're like, oh, am I going to like look like a werewolf?
Right.
So we don't have as much of those terminal hairs. So the terminal hairs that we have aren't all over the face. Most of them are called villus, those little fine baby hairs.
Mm.
We do have some areas that can have terminal hairs, but yeah, it's not that, it all depends on the ability for those hairs to be terminal or villus. So we won't get that all over our face. So that's good.
Is a man like a man's beard, is that terminal hairs?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
And we
So
know
they
that
could grow like a thicker beard.
testosterone. Yeah, exactly. Testosterone can stimulate it. And certainly, if people have something like polycystic ovarian syndrome, that can also
Mm,
stimulate. I also tell people who have things like rosacea, where their skin can be a little bit more sensitive, or people who have pigmentary issues, just tell them, hey, be careful and be cautious with it.
okay. Yeah, that leads up to like dosage. Is there ever too much red light therapy? Is it like best to do this under the care of a dermatologist? That way, you know you're doing it correctly?
Yeah, I think that dosage absolutely matters. And that's where we go back to those low energy stimulate. We don't want to use too high. So in the study, certainly the dosages do matter. And so I think as a consumer, one things we want to look at is what's called an FDA clearance. And for most medical devices, they go through a pathway called a 510K clearance through the FDA, and they have to demonstrate safety. So when you're looking, you'd want to look for a device that has that FDA clearance. Sometimes they'll say FDA approved, but there are devices that go through that, like fillers. But, that's often to me a telltale sign that, okay, that's not legit, because people can make all kinds of claims. But I would look for an FDA clearance on a device. And there are devices out there that do have FDA clearance for those indications.
Okay. So maybe that's where like the price difference comes into. I'm guessing those probably are the more expensive ones.
Yeah, and people have asked about like small little wands and other things to use. Most of the ones out there have, again, what's called light emitting diodes. So laser light can travel really long distances without spread or losing the energy. Light emitting diodes are similar to other light, that they kind of diffuse out. So distance matters. Because it's like you could just say, well, maybe I'll turn the mask on and 5 feet away. And that's why kind of a lot of them they conform to the skin or can bend on the skin. So that matters as well in when choosing a device.
Gotcha. Is there like a time period that you're supposed to use it for, whether it be a mask or a cap or a like one of those in a gym that you just stand in front of or sit in front of?
Yeah, it's there. Oftentimes they have a time period. So it's, a few minutes to like a few dozen minutes in each of the devices. And, it has it do it like on a daily basis. So a lot of times people will do that while they're watching TV or doing other things. Yeah, so that could be fine to do.
And it's safe for your eyes?
So that's a good question. So it turned out that the blue light ones, the FDA had a recall in a device that was for acne. So, the devices that have that FDA clearance, they are considered in the risk category that they should be eye safe. So you don't have to use eye protection. But if you come to see me and I do a laser in the office, those are class 4, so really like high risk, powerful devices. And those you need to have either internal shields that I put inside your eye, but mostly metal shields that I put on the surface. And a
Mm,
lot of times the patient will say, if I could see like a flash of the visible light, or if we're using something called intense pulse light or broadband light, you can see that. And we, as laser surgeons, we wear goggles. So there is light that penetrates because, well, we need to see what we're treating. We don't want to be blinded. So we let them know that even though a small amount of light is visible to us as well, it's safe. So there's certainly eye protection, but the ones that are for consumers, you don't have to use that eye protection.
okay, that makes sense. So beyond kind of the beauty benefits of hair and face and skin, what about like medically? Can this be used to, and maybe not like FDA approved, but can this be used for other reasons beyond kind of this vain aspect?
Yeah. Well, I like to say that, skin longevity and skin health is not a manner, like it's not vanity, it's vitality.
I like that.
The, the skin is the most imaged organ. So in medicine, we often think, oh, MRIs and X-rays and other things. Again, with 3.2 billion images and 700,000 hours of video images uploaded every day, the skin is the organ that we see. And we know from social psychology that attractiveness, or how our skin looks, conveys things to other people, like how smart we are. People assume that if we're more attractive, we're more competent or smart. Or if you're in a jury, they may think you're more likely to be innocent. So I think all of these things matter. And I see people and patients who are very young, in their teens or 20s, and people who are centenarians or near centenarians. And there are many times that those people who are living in their 80s and 90s, they care about how their skin looks because they want to convey to themselves and other people that they are vital. I don't know if you have previously had podcasts on social psychology, but Ellen Langer was a social psychologist who did this experiment where she took 75-year-old men, put them in a cabin, took pictures of them, of course, before, put them in a cabin with everything from when they were 55, pictures of when they were 55, magazines from when they were 55, obviously covered all the mirrors. And then after a week of staying that way, they evaluated things like hand grip. They actually showed pictures of them to people who had no idea about what experiment they'd undergone. And it showed that I think it was like a 3-year average that people on average looked 3 years younger if they just lived like they were a couple of decades younger. So
Interesting.
yeah, that's just my soapbox about skin
All right.
vitality.
Okay. I stand
Yeah,
corrected.
yeah.
But there, I mean, it's healing cancer and stuff too, though, isn't it?
Yeah, so there are some lasers that we use that do have anti-cancer benefits, but the usual photobiomodulation that does not do that. The energies that we use for red light can actually target skin cells, but again, that energy that we use is much higher and it's in office. That one is not what's available at home. So that's something called photodynamic therapy. But it turns out that when we use things that sensitize to light, people actually go out and can get natural sun too. But again, in a controlled environment where we put on these photosensitizers in a medical setting and have them be exposed, but not the home devices. But those have been studied in things like athletic performance, muscle strength, and actually even nerve regrowth. I've had a family member who's suffered a spinal cord injury, and I researched to see, hey, what is the role of photobiomodulation in this? And there are a number of studies that did show protection of the nerves and regrowth of the nerves. And so again, I think we're even though we've been studying this for a while, because we have the ability to study this large data sets and use machine learning to find the connections, I think we're going to optimize those settings more and more. And I think we'll be using these therapies more and more in our practice.
Wow. I know it feels like fast science for those of us who don't have like the medical background, and it's gaining popularity on social media. But can you talk about kind of the longevity here? Because I know there's been things, practices like 100 years ago that were used. Tanning beds used to be thought to be safe and okay and even beneficial, or using x-rays to like measure children's feet. So long term, in 100 years, is there anything we need to be concerned about here?
Yeah, I think with scientific discovery, we want to, even after things are available, we want to study the safety of them. If we find anything, and we still use x rays for a lot of evaluation. And we use focused radiation to treat cancers as well. So, yeah, I think that there are a lot of things that we later realized are potentially dangerous. But again, with these, we're using very low wavelengths. So I think the main thing is for us to be able to discover the exact safe parameters. But of course, we want to stay on top of what's safe or not. And I think it's hard to know and differentiate science from science fiction. And I'm a lover of science fiction, but it's our job as dermatologists, and obviously you've taken this on as your job to also help bring science to have a seat at the table. So I'm happy that you're doing that. And I think when you ask, should you wait to go see your dermatologist? I think that that's great. And my patients now more and more are coming to me asking me about their skin regimen or these red light devices. I think that's probably one of the most asked questions when people come to see me, whether it's for an aesthetic or a medical thing. And it's great, but we dermatologists are only 1.3% of all physicians. So we're a bit of like kind of a unicorn. It's hard to find us and get to us. So
Interesting.
it's, just making this information accessible to people in a way. And so I think, keep looking up things. There's also a lot of research that's what's called open source. So a lot of research was behind a paywall, but now there's more and more medical journals that are becoming open source where everyone can have access to this research because everyone should have access to it.
Okay. So we're going into the holiday season. Let's say somebody's thinking, I want one of these for
Yeah.
Christmas. What do you suggest? Like, there just are a lot of options coming at us. There's masks, there's neck things, there's like partial masks, there's going somewhere to stand in front of a red light. Like, what's a good place to start, and how do you know what's gonna work?
Yeah, I didn't realize that the gym has that. My
I think
yoga
I've seen like high-end gyms, not my gym, like a really bougie gym.
yeah, my yoga studio has different lights, but I think those are like more for mood.
Yeah.
And definitely like with the heat, it's interesting because it feels good.
Yeah.
And I think the muscles do help. So I think when you're going out there to see what's there, I think it's really hard. And I will tell you that it's really hard even for dermatologists who aren't experts in laser and light because they're like, wait a minute, I can go on these online platforms like Amazon, and there's thousands of them there,
Mhm.
or I can step into a Sephora and see that there's so many. So I would say look for an FDA clearance for the device. You can look at the back of it. The FDA actually has what's called a MAUD database, which I hope that the FDA will make more user friendly because it's like really hard to search. But anyone could go online and look up MAUD. And then you can actually go and search the name and to see if there's like things that have been reported. And as consumers, people can report them too. And then of course look at cost. I think that if you have something at home, one of the nice things is that it makes it more accessible to people so you don't have to pay $400 a month to go to an expensive gym to stand in front of something just for a few minutes.
Mhm.
You have access to it to do it at home as well.
Yeah, and it seems like repetition is key. Like, do you have any idea how long it might take to see results?
Yeah, I think it takes our skin turns over about every 28 days. So that very top layer of skin, the epidermis. So I tell people whatever you're going to use is going to take a little bit of time, and then there's cumulative benefit. So if you keep using them and then do it as part of your other regimen. So, you don't want to dig a hole while you're filling the hole. So good sun protection and other things in your skin regimen that are complementary, but I'd say at least a couple of months to do that.
Is there anything else you wanna share about red light therapy or about your work in general?
I guess, can I give a plug for a little podcast that I have
Absolutely.
with one of my amazing colleagues, Dr. James Pethulis, who is one of our chief residents at Stanford. And, we're constantly being asked and have requests from media to say, hey, what's a skincare trend? It's like, is beef tallow thing good? Or actually, there's a trend on TikTok where you put beer on your skin and then go out into the bees. And I thought, well, that's a great way to attract bees and flies. So we have a Skin Innovation Lab podcast that we have. So we're trying to bring science to have a seat at the table in skin science.
Was perennial sunning on the list of crazy online trends that you've addressed yet?
Yes, yes, yeah. I know it is quite fascinating. I know it's when some patients are like, I'm getting a little natural light for my psoriasis. I'm like, just make sure that you're not in a place where your poor neighbors have to be exposed to you going out there or that they could be exposed to. And if you don't want people to, see. But yeah, oh my goodness, I could tell you the trends and happy to chat with you
There's so many.
anytime about them and say, okay, let me dig into whether this is scientifically valid or not.
Yeah. Wow. Well, your work is fascinating. So thank you so much for sharing it all with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.